Welcome to Crisis After Crisis. We are very excited that so many of you have joined us live today for a conversation with a vibrant panel of corporate leaders and field builders about a topic that I know at least is very top of mind for me these days, and I suspect for all of you as well, and that's disaster response. My name is Nikhil Bumb, and I'm a managing director at FSG, and I also head FSG's corporate practice. And today I'll be joined in conversation by my colleague, Megan Linquidi. For those of you who may not be familiar, FSG is a global nonprofit, and we are dedicated to advancing strategies for equitable systems change. A few housekeeping items for today's webinar. First, we want to hear from you all throughout this conversation. So we've kept the chat open. We'd love for you to chime in throughout the conversation. As you hop on, and many of you have already begun to do so, please introduce yourself, share your name, your organization, where you're calling in from today. It's always fun to see where across the globe we have folks joining from. We also have a Q&A box, so please use it to share your questions. We'll be reserving time at the end of each round of panelists for Q&A. A few tech tips and slides for today's webinar will be made available on fsg.org. We'll also be sharing them by email with everyone who registered for the webinar. We have live captions turned on, and to access them, you can see the instructions on the slide in front of you. And finally, if you have technical difficulties or need any help throughout today's session, please share it in the chat or email info@fsg.org. All right, before we go further, I just want to take a moment and introduce our wonderful lineup of speakers. Today, Megan and I are very excited to gather in conversation with four phenomenal leaders who are all deeply engaged in responding to disasters and crises. We have Alice Turner from UPS, Devin Matthias from the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, Karen Little, who's joining us from PayPal, and Kiran Kumar from the Northern California Grantmakers. We'll do proper introductions of each of them as we bring them on shortly, but wanted to go ahead and tell you who will be joining us today. So let's dive in. Why are we talking about this topic? I don't think I have to really explain it to you all who have joined, but we know that the frequency of disasters is increasing over time. We've seen that the number of billion-dollar disasters has been well above average in recent years. And not only is the frequency of disasters increasing, but the types of disasters is expanding that we all respond to, and the cost of those disasters is increasing as well. I think I read somewhere that in the US alone, the average cost of billion-dollar disasters over the last 5 years has been more than double the 45-year average that preceded it. So for those of you who know FSG, you know that we work with purpose-led companies to support how they advance social impact across their organizations, across their portfolios. And in the course of that work, we noticed a few trends over the past several years in terms of how our clients and purpose-led companies are responding to disasters specifically. Whereas in the past, it may have been a smaller portion of companies giving CSR, philanthropic, or even core business portfolios, we have seen that corporate disaster giving is on the rise. So not only are companies now responding to a wider array of crises, from pandemics or natural climate-related events, or even geopolitical crises, they're also increasing the magnitude of their response. Since 2020, 53% of companies have increased both the quantity of disasters to which they respond, and over 60% of companies have also increased their philanthropic spend on disasters. So that's good, since the disasters are also increasing, that the corporate disaster giving is on the rise. And we know that companies have a unique role to play and a vital role to play in the disaster ecosystem. But this increase is also coming from an increasing and growing expectation from corporate stakeholders. So that includes companies' employees, your customers, your community members, your suppliers, and even a company's public and social sector partners are all looking for companies to respond more and more to disasters. And specifically, we've noticed an increase in that in the past roughly 7 years. So what we saw was that so many of our companies were evolving the way that they were responding to disasters, finding the need to do so at a faster pace than before. And even those who were evolving quite quickly were reaching out to us to ask, what are my peers doing? What are others doing? How are they advancing their approaches? What can we learn from them so we can all learn better together and support this ecosystem? Because not one of us is going to address it by ourselves. So last year, we at FSG embarked on a journey to put pen to paper and document these changes in the field. I'm pleased to share that we just released a new resource that is available for download on FSG's website. And my partner in this journey, partner in crisis, if you will, has been Megan, who you'll hear from in a moment. Our report was based on a number of research and in-depth interviews that we did with companies across industries. And we thought we'd take the moment to document some of the trends, the tools, the frameworks, and best practices that we're observing in the field. And today's conversation builds on that. So you can go to the link on the screen to download the resource. It is available for free. And we also have shared the link in the chat for today's conversation. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Megan, but today we're excited to dive into some of those findings from the report, as I mentioned. We'll also be hearing from Alice, Devin, Karen, and Kieran on how they are each shifting their approaches and some of how they're applying what we shared in the report. So today we will share some of those tools and frameworks that others are using to support their decision-making at the moment of a crisis in terms of how they react and how they respond. We'll also share some of the innovative and best practices that we heard. And finally, we're going to talk about how stakeholders across the disaster response ecosystem, not just companies, can more effectively connect and collaborate in order to better respond to better recover from, and hopefully to reduce the impact of disasters. All right, it gives me great pleasure to now introduce Megan Linquiti, a senior consultant from FSG who has been a partner with me along this journey. And as Megan comes on, we would love to just start with a quick audience poll. So our question to you is, does your company currently have a structure or tool, be that a set of criteria, a process by which you support decision-making at the time when a disaster occurs? So we're going to launch a Zoom poll. Please take a moment to answer it. We'd just love to hear where folks are in the room.
Thanks, Nikhil. Really excited to see where folks are sitting on the spectrum.
Yeah, looks like we have folks sort of coming in all across. Megan, I remember when we first started this research about a year ago, that this was the main question we heard from folks, right? Do others also have, or do they have, how are they using criteria, processes, tools, frameworks to decide, should I respond to this disaster? Should I not respond? How should I respond? And we know that even those who have tools in place are looking for better tools or what others are doing, because there's always this idea that there might be a way to improve.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it looks like we're about split in this group for folks who currently have a structure for decision making and folks who don't. I'm really excited to present some of the key themes from this report. And I think that there's a lot here for folks, no matter where they are in the process of developing a strategy.
All right. Well, I'm going to let you do that, and I'm going to head off for a bit, Megan.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be sharing some of these key themes. In our conversations with companies across geographies and industries, we really saw a number of encouraging trends in the corporate disaster response space. For example, as Nikhil mentioned, we heard that companies are really expanding the way that they think about what qualifies as a disaster to include events like public health emergencies with COVID or humanitarian crises. And we also heard that a lot of companies are really trying to integrate their disaster response work into their overall social impact portfolios and strategies to align their disaster giving with that overall philanthropic strategy. But throughout this work, we also learned a lot about sort of the questions that companies are grappling with as they're carrying out this work. Companies are really considering how to approach disaster response, how to embed equity across their strategies, how to support work beyond immediate relief, and how to deploy the wide range of levers beyond traditional philanthropy that we know are available to companies. So most consistently throughout our work, both with clients and in this research specifically, we heard that companies are really looking to put increased structure to their disaster response work. The most common questions that we heard were, how are other companies deciding which crises to respond to? How are they deciding which approaches to take? What can I learn from others? And how can I make my strategy more impactful? And from our research, we found that companies that are doing this well are typically following a three-stage process to sort of set their disaster response strategy. These stages outline a process for deciding when and how to respond to crises in a way that helps companies be strategic and impactful and equitable, but also timely and proactive. So diving into this framework, the first stage of the process is really planning for decision making. We know that there are so many disasters unfolding seemingly every day, and that companies simply cannot respond to all of them. And as mentioned, one challenge that we heard come up a lot is creating a process for deciding when to respond. And so we developed a set of common criteria that we heard companies using to assess a possible response. These include the overlap between impacted areas and the company's operational geography, the relevance of a crisis to companies' key stakeholders, whether that's customers, employees, folks throughout their supply chain. And there are also, and these sort of specific considerations sit alongside more general considerations for philanthropic investment, like the scope of a disaster, the impacted community's level of need, and the company's positioning for impact. And so in putting this into action and implementing a decision-making framework like this, we also identified several tools that companies can use. For example, a disaster assessment scorecard can lay out ahead of time all of the factors that a company might want to consider when they are making a decision of whether or not to respond, synthesizing across all of the relevant criteria that exists in a situation. And this entire structure can also be underpinned by proactive stakeholder engagement that builds buy-in, especially at the executive level ahead of time, and ensures that perspectives of multiple stakeholders are included in decision-making. So once a company has decided that they are going to respond to a specific disaster, the next decision point that we saw is understanding when during the disaster management cycle they are going to support. And so, as many of you probably know, the four main phases of the disaster cycle are immediate relief when a disaster strikes, long-term recovery efforts, mitigation of future disasters, and preparedness. And we know that work across all four of these phases is very important, and that the vast majority of disaster funding goes towards this immediate relief. But this approach leaves money and impact on the table because we know that dollars spent on mitigation and preparedness save both money and lives in the long term. And in our research, we learned that leading companies who are doing this really well, are increasingly investing in these mitigation and preparedness phases, which is especially relevant in a world where we're living increasingly in gray sky times, from disaster to disaster, when it's not clear exactly which phase we're in. And this approach can really contribute to increased community resilience. So we're going to launch another poll here to get a sense of which phases of the cycle folks in the room are currently supporting. So you'll be able to choose multiple options. Curious to see sort of which are the ones that you all are focusing on. Thank you everyone for responding. Yes, seeing a good mix across. And like I said, we know these are all important to be supporting, and that there's a lot of pressures on companies to respond from external audiences, from their employees. So curious to see sort of how this group levels out. looks like responses are starting to slow a little bit. Thank you so much, everyone, for responding. And it really looks like we have the bulk of folks in this room responding in this immediate relief category, but we have a really good mix across recovery, mitigation, and preparedness as well, which is really exciting to see sort of how people are plugging in across this cycle. So regardless of which phase of work a company decides to support, the third stage of this process really looks at how companies can most effectively respond. Almost every company we know has an employee relief plan. Many do traditional grant making or in-kind donations, but it was also really exciting to see how companies are increasingly leveraging all of their available assets and deploying a range of levers beyond this traditional philanthropic response in response to crises. For example, companies might activate their core business capability. This might be especially relevant for companies in the logistics or healthcare spaces. Others might think about activating their employees to provide manpower or expertise where needed. And I think this sort of broader sense of what are the assets that we have available, what are the levers that we can utilize, can also really facilitate effective engagement throughout all four phases of the disaster management cycle beyond just immediate relief. So more in the report, we dropped the link in the chat, but I am going to pass it back to Nikhil and our wonderful panelists to talk about what this looks like in action.
Thanks, Megan. First of all, it's just great while Megan was sharing some of the findings, I was just taking a look and seeing where folks are calling in from. We have folks joining us, I think I counted nearly 10 countries and 4 continents. So clearly, this is a topic that matters, as we all know, a great deal, and we're seeing increasing number of disasters. So without honestly further ado, I just love to call on our first set of panelists. And we're going to spend the first half of today's conversation talking to two leading change makers who are actually guiding their company's disaster response efforts. So joining us for the first part of today's conversation are our panelists Alice and Karen. Alice Turner is a manager of social impact and the UPS Foundation at UPS. And Karen Little is the global lead of rapid response and strategic partnerships at PayPal. So welcome, Alice. Welcome, Karen. Thank you for joining us. Alice, I would love to start with you. How do you see UPS's role as a company within the broader humanitarian ecosystem? Why is it important for UPS to have a disaster response strategy, especially with all the recent disasters?
Yes, thank you. First, I just want to say how excited I am to be here today. A huge thank you to FSG for bringing us all together. And your report, it was absolutely wonderful, had valuable insights, but it had such an incredible network of people contributing who are driving real impact every day. When it comes to UPS's role in disasters, we're really uniquely positioned. Fun fact that humanitarian organizations spend at least 40% of their budget on logistics. So our most obvious role in the ecosystem is to do what we do best, right? Moving materials quickly. The faster we can get supplies to where they are needed most, the more lives we can impact. We leverage our existing supply chain, our expertise to help absorb some of those costs so that more of the funds raised by the nonprofits can go directly to the life-saving supplies. But our role goes beyond just transportation, right? We also focus on enhancing supply chains. In the private sector, logistics companies, we regularly outsource part of our supply chain, right? We pool resources, even with our competitors, because we all have the same goal. We want to improve speed, cost efficiency, and we want to deliver with really high customer satisfaction. This practice isn't widely adopted the same way in the humanitarian sector. So UPS, we're members of what we call the Logistics Emergency Team, where we work with our competitors to provide impact and deliver aid. And we've seen other very promising results with other organizations as well when logistics providers provide collaboration to hard to reach areas. and communities, or when they pull their resources together. But we know there's still so much room for innovation. In disaster affected areas, logistics capacity, it's extremely limited, of course, and collaboration is the best way to optimize those resources. So that's why UPS isn't just moving supplies, we're working with nonprofits, we're working with our humanitarian partners to rethink the logistics strategies, right? We're not just delivering aid, we're optimizing the supply chains. And when we look at the future of humanitarian logistics, we really see it in joint procurement, shared transportation, storage, and pooled resources. And UPS is working to help drive that transformation. We know the more efficient humanitarian logistics can become, the more every dollar stretches to maximize that impact. As far as our strategy, I mean, everyone said it, and it's so true. Disasters are becoming more frequent, more severe, more complex. And so it is very important to have a clear, structured disaster strategy. No one company can be everything to all people, right? Or everything to all nonprofits. So you have to have planning. You have to, knowing what you can and can't do and having that outlined is very important, because when the answer is no, we can't help, the nonprofits need to know that quickly so that they're able to work to find another solution without wasting any time. With our strategy, before a crisis even hits, we know all of our internal and external partners, right? Ensuring the relationship with the UPS network and our nonprofit partners is strong. We are pre-positioning supplies for our partners, and we provide funding upfront at the very beginning of the year so that nonprofits have exactly what they need to make decisions in that first 24 hours. When disaster strikes, our very first thing is to work with our HR team, right? We need to support impacted employees and families, and we know that first 24 hours, our nonprofits are using those pre-existing funds, and they're assessing those broader needs. Second, we start mobilizing our feeder team, our healthcare division, really our entire network, because our partners, they know how to engage with UPS to move shipments. And at that point, we sit ready to act. And then after the first few weeks of urgent shipments, we start transitioning into long-term recovery, because disaster response doesn't end when the headlines fade, right? It's about helping people get back to their homes, having the businesses rebuild, because these are our customers, right? And our businesses. And when they recover quickly, the entire economy benefits. And, Megan mentioned it earlier, but it's not just about philanthropy. It aligns with our core business. Just like power companies need to restore the electricity after storms, we have to restore that supply chain, right? One example that I want to highlight is during COVID-19, where UPS played a critical role in the vaccine distribution. Over 1 billion vaccines that first year, 100% accuracy. And then we use that same supply chain to deliver vaccines to underserved communities. This is proof point that really the private sector expertise in logistics isn't just helpful, it's really essential to disaster response.
Yeah, I really like that example, Allison. I'm going to come back to it in a little bit. But before that, maybe Karen Little, just to bring you into the conversation, similar question, why is responding to disasters important to PayPal, and how does that influence your response? We just heard from Alice about how it's really core to UPS and who they are. I want to hear about how that works for PayPal.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Nikhil, and thanks FSG for having us. And I have to say, hi, everybody who's dialed in. Like Nikhil, I am blown away. I mean, we have, talk about Canada representing, we have Vancouver, Calgary, Alberta, Montreal, and Toronto. Toulouse, Italy, London, Brazil, Sri Lanka, Ghana, Ethiopia, Finland, Kenya. I mean, wow, you guys, thank you for joining from all these parts of the world. This is obviously something that touches all of us. And so I just want to express my appreciation also for the range of companies who are here, like hi to our nonprofit friends, hi to corporate peers. We're all in this together. I'm very passionate about disaster philanthropy. And so I'm just really glad we're having this conversation. So I've been doing this now for about 5 years at PayPal. For those who know me, I spent 15 years on the nonprofit side, and now it's been 5 years on the private sector side. And so I've really been able to get a sense of like how the engine of the private sector works, and as it relates to disaster response. If you think about PayPal, if you think about Venmo, so I love how Alice can provide that physical product, like logistical side of disaster response, and then with the PayPal side, it's the tech response. So I co-chair the tech sector disaster working group, which is a mix of Apple, Amazon, Google, Uber, Airbnb. There's a group of us that come together via WhatsApp, and we are always closely in touch because there are really beautiful ways we can work together. When there's a crisis, Cisco can provide connectivity. Uber doesn't work, PayPal doesn't work without connectivity. So we need Cisco, we need the connectivity or someone to help with that. Airbnb can provide free housing. What we do, our core capability, is payment processing, which sounds very boring, but it is actually really important, obviously, in times of crisis. So we're always looking at it from that angle. And so for us, what that means is certain things that we've done in the past that really, will resonate for this conversation is we enabled people in Ukraine to receive money via PayPal for the first time. That did not exist before, February, March of 2022. So there was a core team of people who turned on the ability for people there to receive money. And that has been tremendous for P2P, peer-to-peer, transfer of money. We also think about it in that we have 500 million customers globally, and then we have 30 million merchants globally. So we do think a lot about small and medium-sized businesses. We think a lot about our customers. And so what we do is we stand up opportunities for customers to give, or we, for example, waive fees for customers or small businesses. We will defer repayments. Many people don't know this, but we provide loans to small businesses so we can defer or not collect repayments from small businesses. So that's like one example. It's important to us because it touches everybody. And so I see it as like one role we can play, in partnership, in collaboration with so many others. So, I mean, so many of you who are on the call, we have worked together. And there's so much more I could say, but I know we don't have a ton of time. So I will pause there, Nikhil, for the next questions.
Awesome. Well, you touched on many things there. Both of you did. Maybe I'll come back to Karen first, and then I'll come back to Alice after that. But Karen, tell me a little bit about what happens when a disaster strikes, right? Like,
Yeah.
what are the frameworks, the structures that
Yep.
PayPal uses to figure out, are we
Yeah.
responding? What are we responding with?
Yeah, exactly. So before the murder of George Floyd, we did not have a really official framework that was set up. And essentially what we did is we created one after that because we realized that was a rapid response. We deployed $535 million to support racial equity in the United States within 1 year after that. And so we realized we needed to expand our definitions. We had originally just had natural disasters, climate-induced disasters. So we added social justice, humanitarian, and man-made. So man-made was something like Uvalde, in Texas, the shoot, for our international friends, I think, you see these headlines about shootings in the United States. And so that's something where if we have customers or employees in those areas, we will support families of victims. That's a man-made example. So then the framework looks at who are the key stakeholders. So every company is going to be similar and different. Ours is our employees, our customers, and the corporation. And then from there, we look at through their lens, how is this disaster impacting them? And our guiding principles are for speed and for impact and consistency because we did not have that. And so then what we did is we put together a menu of interventions, which sounds so simple, but it was like we didn't have it. And so what can we do at the corporate level? What can we do at the employee level? What can we do at the customer level? And it's a long list. I mean, it's phenomenal. It's all these tools that we can use, and unlock. And there's of course like a rubric for like which ones need executive approval, which ones can I just do, that kind of thing. So that's really helpful. And then we have the PayPal designed scorecard. So everyone, I do think, should have one. It is very helpful. So we took a look at what are the most important things to us. We're looking at like what is the, the lives impacted. What's the rebuilding time going to take? What is the nonprofit, the charity sector doing? Like, are they mobilizing? How much are they mobilizing? We look at reputation risk for not doing anything. We look at a lot of things. What's great about it is then we get 3 different scores. So we get one for customer, one for employee, and one for corporation, not one score for the whole event. So that means like there are times when it's going to be like a level 1 for employee, but like not even a level 1, 2, or 3 for customer. So then we'll just stand up an employee campaign with Benevity or something. But what's nice about it is that our executives know that we have this. We also have a rapid response committee, and that includes anti-bribery and corruption, legal, marketing, comms. I chair that, and we have probably 20 people who are on it. So when we do the assessment and I run it by the committee and we go to our executives in the same day, they know that when we're coming to them and we're saying it's a level 1 for customer, these are the interventions we recommend. It's a level 2 for employee, these are the interventions. Usually then within like a few hours, we can get a response. Yes, this is approved, move forward. Maybe a few questions, but generally that's how we move quickly. And if you think about it, for someone like us, the quicker the better, because we're trying to raise money. So you lose that really critical time if you don't already have that. We use PayPal Giving Fund, which is our platform, our donor advised fund, and that's what we used, to profile charities. And so we already have partnerships. Many of you are on here, and so we look at like the charity selection piece too, of a blend of the large international or national with hyper local. We have a lot of employees in the Philippines. So we want to like, if it's something in Manila, we want to get like some orgs in Manila. But in a nutshell, that's how we approach it. And
Yeah.
hi, Joseph. He's with me on the Tech Sector Disaster Working Group. I love that you're here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Karen. Clearly, both PayPal and UPS are doing so much. And as you said, right, that list of options is so much bigger than we often think it is. So maybe one more question, pulling a little bit also from the audience Q&A that's been coming in. Alice, question for you. We heard a little bit about what you were doing earlier. We also heard about the variety of ways that Karen shared in terms of what PayPal responds to. Tell us a little bit about the range of levers that you at UPS deploy in responding to crises. I remember when we spoke last year, you talked about both things that feel more tied closely to the business and things that feel a little bit more philanthropic. And so would love to hear some examples of each.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Karen mentioned it, superpowers. Every company has their superpowers, the core strengths that make a difference that you can really leverage in disaster response. At UPS, I think we really have 4. So transportation, of course, right? Getting supplies anywhere fast, that's our bread and butter. We practice shipping with our partners during blue skies so that when disaster hits, we're all on the same page. Our partners know the process to follow to make a shipment happen. They know how many shipments, I can do for them. There's no guesswork. It's just immediate action. The expertise I talked about a little bit earlier, we specialize in supply chain management, healthcare logistics, but also data science, right? We're always innovating to improve the disaster response. We deploy our employees with our nonprofit partners to fill different gaps. Our employees know how to operate a warehouse efficiently. They know how to get the relief items through customs. There is a UPSer in every single one of our neighborhoods, no matter what country you're from, that knows every road and knows how to work around that road, even when Google Maps isn't working. So we use our expertise to also do things like build systems, right? To help organizations be more efficient. So one example is, it's an acronym, it's called Eduardo. It is Emergency Dashboard Utility for Air Freight Resource and Delivery Options, right? It's our data scientists working with Google. The tool is essentially Google Flights for nonprofits that are looking for cargo space. So that's just one example. Our third lever that we pull is our people power. 500,000 employees globally, right? And service is in our DNA. So even when your expertise isn't in supply chain, our employees are still incredible. We have people from departments, HR, marketing, it doesn't matter, but they'll volunteer their time to do different items such as pick and packs, distribution events, or even volunteer at different shelter during disasters. And then, Karen's right, that's always around money, right? So our fourth lever is funding. And we provide grants, but the key is we don't just do checkbook philanthropy. Anytime we're funding an organization, we also use one of the other levers to ensure that 1 + 1 can equal 4 or 5. And then as far as when we decide what to use and when to use it, our nonprofits know best. There's plenty of nonprofits on this call. They know best. So we look to them to maintain open communication. They understand at the beginning what we can offer, and together we can identify the right solutions for them. I mean, at the end of the day, the goal is simple: the right resources to the right place at the right time.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And gosh, Karen and Alice, I feel like I could spend the entire hour talking to both of you, but we did ask two great field builders to join us as well. So I'm going to bid you adieu for a little bit. We'll bring you back on the end. And we are going to invite our next two panelists to join us. So first, we have Devin Matias, who is a Senior Director of Development at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. And then we also have Kiran Kumar, who is the Director for Climate and Disaster Resilience at the Northern California Grantmakers. So both Devin and Kiran's organizations are partners to many companies in their disaster response work. And you both offer a very different perspective on the field. One of you takes more of a national perspective. Kiran, you take more of that local or that regional perspective with the California state. And you also each bring experience working on disaster response in other sectors, not just with private sector partners, but also public and social sector partners. So, Devin, I'll start with you. Let's start national first. What do you see as the role that companies can play in the disaster response ecosystem? And how does that differ across different phases of that disaster management cycle that Megan was talking about?
No, thank you. And, to echo what Karen and Alice said, just thank you for letting me join, and thank you to everybody who signed on. I will share behind the scenes that Karen and I were just messaging as the number kept going up and up, just about how incredible it is to see so many people engaged. And I'm going to do a small, I guess, correction, and that it's not just national. Like CDP, we're looking around the globe and internationally, and we're very fortunate to have some great people on our team that just know this space so well. But back to your question in terms of like how companies can play in this ecosystem relative to the cycle, it's important to take a multi-phased role. Effective disaster response requires a full comprehensive approach across all phases of that cycle. There's no start time or length that is specific to relief or recovery, et cetera. There's not a disaster and then, 3 Tuesdays later, you switch from relief to recovery. It's more about how you approach things. At CDP, like when we define a disaster, it is where a hazard meets a vulnerability. And I think that's important just to note in that if you had asked me 6 years ago before I had joined CDP, what's a disaster? I would have just said, I don't know, a hurricane, a tornado, etc. But when you start to frame it as that hazard actually meeting the vulnerability, you can start to address those vulnerabilities every single day of the year. It doesn't have to be after that hurricane hit or after an earthquake or fire, etc., exacerbated the impact of those vulnerabilities. At the center of your approach should always be the communities that are impacted. One way to look at this, or I guess a little story to think about, like in terms of how we look at it, is a disaster occurs, it's being covered in the media, and one of the first images that you'll see or that maybe comes to mind is there are incredible volunteers out there handing out meals and helping people with tents or whatever may be needed. What you want to strive for and what we strive for is getting past that, where people can go to their own kitchen or pantry and decide what they're having for dinner instead of having it given to them, having that agency of choice to be able to decide like what they need and where they're going. In terms of how companies can help. There are varying but crucial roles. When it comes to preparedness, you can think about investing in infrastructure. You can develop business continuity plans, and you can support community preparedness initiatives. In immediate response, you heard the logistical support that UPS does. It's amazing. And what PayPal does to make it easier to have financial aid for those that have been impacted. And then as you look at medium and long-term recovery, there are a lot of ways to approach equitable recovery. And it's about finding what aligns with your company's goals and priorities. For some, that may be supporting mental health. For others, rebuilding efforts and supporting economic revitalization. And for others, it may be investing in things like a long-term recovery group so that you can ensure there's a strategic approach to how things are being tackled for the community. We at CDP, we advocate for strategic, equitable, and effective disaster recovery. So we always encourage moving up beyond ad hoc donations, try to develop long-term partnerships with reputable organizations with hopefully you've already known in advance of the disaster and it's not a scramble when the disaster occurs. Focus on those underlying vulnerabilities, as I noted. For example, like in Lahaina, affordable housing was a vulnerability. It was already a crisis. So you want to be able to, help, and it was only exacerbated by the challenge of the fires. I will note, tap into the superpowers have been noted, and I love that was what they were called at one point. Use them for good. You've heard how UPS has provided logistics and how PayPal can help with getting money to those in need. There's Expedia Group, for example, they've got the tools and expertise to be able to connect those that have been impacted by a disaster with housing and resources. But what you heard in all those examples is they've listened to the communities. Yeah. That's at the core of it. So Hurricane Ian, there was a generator company that wanted to get a ton of generators out, but without thinking about how do we train people to do this successfully? How do they do it safely? And one other example I'll give in terms of how you partner on this with long-term recovery is that Truist knew they wanted to help Western North Carolina, and they wanted to do it without assuming they knew how to help local communities. So we're incredibly thankful they partnered with us to help make sure those dollars get to the right place, but also while listening to the community. And what I think would resonate with a lot of the teams and companies on this call is that they also did it with taking some of the legwork and all the work off of their small teams plate, because I think we see nonstop that teams like those that are on this call, how under-resourced they are, and they just can't do it all.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Devin. You referenced a fire, so I want to bring in Karen. Karen, let's talk about the context of California. To say that California sees disasters with some regularity feels like an understatement. How have you seen companies evolve their approaches over time in that context? And is there anything particular innovative that you want to highlight in the recent crises?
Yeah, thanks, Nikhil, Devin, and the rest of the panel. So appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit more about our context in California. So I'm definitely going to get to your question, but I'm just struck by the really kind of pointed questions in the Q&A here. And I wanted to tie a couple of pieces together that we've been hearing throughout the day to then get to your question. One, Devin, I love the framing. I hate it also, where a hazard meets a vulnerability. The way that we talk about disasters in California is that hazards are natural, but disasters are man-made, right? And there's some questions in the chat around, particularly in the United States context, what are we doing around supporting communities long-term to build resilience, as there are kind of large questions around federal funding and what we're seeing around the politicization of disasters. And the thing that I'll just note with both of those frames is addressing these vulnerabilities, addressing these man-made issues requires systems change. It requires looking at policies. It requires looking at the social safety nets that exist in communities, and it requires looking at the capacity that exists in communities. And so when we talk about long-term support, when we talk about earlier to Megan's point around investments in recovery and resilience as a cost-saving measure, we have to be thinking about investments at that phase or at that point. To get to your question specifically, Nikhil, I think there's a couple of things that we've been seeing, but to the points I just made, what we're seeing in California from a corporate disaster response standpoint is a moving beyond kind of the reactive donations approach to a more proactive strategic engagement with communities around kind of long-term recovery and resilience. I think that's also driven by just the frequency and the increasing severity of disasters in California. But a couple of examples. So we've seen more and more pre-positioning of resources. So companies proactively positioning supplies and funding and response teams before a disaster actually strikes. We have the technology to know kind of when and how a disaster is going to strike, and so being able to pre-position resources is incredibly important in the California context. The other piece that I really want to lift up is around public-private partnerships. We're seeing more businesses, more companies reach out and identify ways to partner with state and local governments, nonprofits, and then also relief agencies to really streamline that aid distribution process. We're increasingly seeing tech firms working with California Office of Emergency Services and FEMA to really enhance the emergency response phase, which is building a long-term muscle for the sector. And then the last one I want to touch on is around, and I think both of our earlier panelists touched on this, employee volunteer networks. So a lot of companies have trained and supported disaster response within their own companies. So Salesforce, Google, other companies actually have response teams that mobilize during crises. So it's kind of a big picture, it's a little picture connecting company to community. And then just really three kind of pieces around innovation. One is around tech and data. So during the wildfires, during these atmospheric river storms, we've seen companies like Google and Waze and UPS provide real-time evacuation and road closure data. We saw Meta leveraging its crisis response features to help people locate aid and connect with loved ones. And then the other big one, and this is emergent and going to be increasingly important, is AI and predictive analytics. So insurance companies, logistics companies using AI to predict kind of fire paths, flood risks, improving evacuation, resource deployment strategies, critical in the context of a effective and responsive approach to disasters. The very last one I will say is, and this feels basic, but it's really important to remember, direct aid to communities. We've seen communities or organizations like Airbnb scaling up initiatives like their open house program to shelter displaced residents, while others are really stepping in to provide direct cash grants. While they're not a sustainable source, they're helping in that 3 to 6 month response phase. So all that to say, we're increasingly seeing, and I think this is because of, again, the severity and the kind of repeat factor of disasters in California, companies stepping up to move beyond just kind of direct grant making into employing data-driven and more strategic approaches to resilience.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. First of all, I have to say, also as a facilitator, you make my job really easy when you are already looking at the Q&A and answering questions and baking them into your responses. But we are going to come back to hopefully at least time for one more audience Q&A. I wanted to come back, however, to something that you both talked about around communities. But even before that, I'm also thinking about the last piece you just shared, Kieran, around some of the use of AI and predictive analytics. And I know one of the things in the report we talk about is and I know multiple companies are doing this, but that, Google is using google.org is using predictive analytics to actually understand when disasters are likely to strike, where they're going to strike, and pre-position and get direct cash transfers out to communities directly. And so it sort of combines many of the innovative pieces that you talked about, and I think is a good example for folks to check out as well. So you both talked about the importance of talking when working directly with community organizations, partnering with them. And we know that while more companies are doing this, for some, this is still relatively new. We heard some questions about how do we do this effectively, especially if we're not a big company, if we're not a UPS, if we're not a google.org, if we're not a PayPal, how do we do this where we can partner more directly with community organizations? And so, briefly, I'd maybe ask both of you to share one tip. Like, how would you get started in that pathway if you were a company? So maybe I'll go to Devin first.
I tried to send it to you first and let you go first, but he said my name. I mean, really, I guess the two words, listen is one, just don't assume and listen to the community, and two, collaboration, be it rather that is with, your peer organizations or those within your network of organizations and companies, or it's with organizations like those represented on the call here today. I think that can go a long way. Just like Karen noted, her tech sector disaster working group, Alice is a part of CDP's retail disaster group, and you see these organizations that you normally think of as competitors, like a Target and a Walmart or a Lowe's and a Home Depot, like working together to be just more impactful when a disaster occurs. So I guess listening and collaboration are the two I'll go with.
Awesome. And Karen, how would you build on that? What does it look like? What's the first step in being a good community partner?
Yeah, you're gonna really try to constrain me to one, and I'm just not gonna be able to do it. And partly because we are active in responding to the LA fires, and so we're in these dialogues continuously with communities right now. I just want to lift up my colleague Lily Bui from the from Southern California Grantmakers, who is actually active in coordinating philanthropic response, and she shared some thoughts with me kind of around this. I would say just three things, right? Position your work around recovery in the long-term phases of disaster. Recovery is way more expensive than response. And so some pre-planning around how we set aside resources to support communities at minimum for a year is really important. The second one is innovation in the giving strategies. And so one thing that we are trying to lift up is if you work in the debt market or around the debt market, consider forgivable loans or no cost or very low cost loans to ensure that communities have access to capital, especially communities that historically don't have access to other pathways for investment. And then the third one is lean into collective impact. I think what we're seeing in LA around the startup of the California Rise Initiative, the LA Rise Initiative, and the Department of Angels is a real kind of leaning in around collective impact, where philanthropy and corporate investment are working together to think about how they can leverage their individual giving to support communities long term. And so those are just three ways that I think we can already proactively position our work around CSR and philanthropic giving to support communities long term. And then to double tap what Devin said is really listen to the communities, do post debriefs with your community around what did we see, what worked, what didn't work, how do we continue this relationship.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I am going to sneak in one quick audience Q&A before we bring Alice and Karen back on. This one's actually for you, Devin. Somebody asked if you can just explain the hazard meets vulnerability in a non, climate related event context.
Sure. Let's see. Okay, so at CDP, we don't necessarily focus on shootings in terms of our actual work and where we put a lot of our time in, because there are experts and other organizations that are just better positioned and know this better. But if you go back to the shooting in Buffalo a few years ago, the vulnerability in that situation is that there was one grocery store, and that one grocery store being taken away as a crime scene, and being taken away as traumatic for people in that community to go to, created a food desert as soon as that shooting occurred. So the vulnerability there was like the limited access to food for that area and that community. But then it became a disaster after the unfortunate events and the shooting.
It's very helpful. Okay, let's bring Alice and Karen back on. Clearly there's so much to share. I asked for one thing, one gave two, Karen, you gave three. So we have a lot that we could answer, but I'm just taking away how rich this conversation is. Clearly there's so much insights, expertise held amongst this group, and we really appreciate you taking the time. Yes, disasters are scary. Yes, they're increasing in frequency and intensity. But also, there's incredible opportunity in terms of the range of things that companies can do, in terms of how they can collaborate with communities and how they can think about systems work at multiple levels. And so it really, I think, you each elevated how that work can be transformative and have better impact. And yes, the other stages of the disaster management cycle are more expensive, but those dollars also go further, as you all noted, in terms of the lasting impact. So, one final closing answer, and I'll say one sentence, knowing that each of you may make that two or three sentences. But what's one practice, and this can be anything small even, that you each use, because you each have been doing this work for a long time, right? So what's one practice each of you use to keep learning about how to improve, how to reimagine, how to advance your organization's response? So I'm going to start with Karen, then we'll go to Devin, Allison, Karen, just so you know the order. So Karen, why don't you open us up?
Okay, well, um, so this is not an official like by design plug, but I use the Center for Disaster Philanthropy to stay up to speed. It is very helpful for me because there's a weekly blog of all of the different crises and what is happening, and how some are complex humanitarian crises, some are hyper local, who's responding. And what I also love about it is when I get asked by executives and everyone, which crises are you monitoring? What are you watching? I can just send them the link to the weekly blog. These are the ones I'm watching. It's very helpful.
Thanks, Karen. Devin, what's one thing you do to keep learning?
I just use the PayPal app. I don't know how to rescind that wonderful. No, Karen, thank you very much. That was wonderful. Thank you. I will say that like having your go-to partners that are outside of your organization. So and that can be the people on this call that I can look to and speak to. And I feel like in CSR, you can feel like you're on an island a lot of the times within your organization where nobody gets you. So if you have others like you at other organizations that you can tap into, or CDP, it can help you a lot.
Great. Alice?
So my background is in nonprofit management, right? And I'm working with a lot of logistics providers, American Red Cross, Salvation Army. One of the things I do is take the trainings that they take. I want to know some of the things they know. So, through LinkedIn, through some of these webinars hosted by all of our different partners, I want to continue learning in that way. So not just corporate philanthropy, but also what are they learning, so that I can have those conversations and when we make decisions together, we're both more informed.
That's awesome. You're putting yourself in their shoes. Karen, what do you do to keep learning?
Well, I want to agree with everything here, from understanding kind of what our partners are listening to, all the way to just really leaning in around CDP's resources and FSG's resources. I want to double plug the report that you all launched. Excellent set of recommendations. What I'll just offer up to the group is a recognition that a disaster response infrastructure exists in every single community. In some places, it is a very formal VOAD or a COAD. In other places, it is an elder who's holding meetings in their living room. And so tapping into those folks who are community leaders to really understand what they need long term, and then lifting that up through our networks to help folks understand not just what that one individual community needs, but what a community in this context will need long term in terms of future disaster response and then into resilience.
I really appreciate that. Well, we are nearing up on the hour, so thank you, audience, for joining today. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Alice, Devin, Kieran, and Karen. Also, we have a lot of Karens on our webinar team, but no, thank you all for joining today's panel, for sharing your insights and your incredible expertise. Thank you, Megan, for partnering with me on this research effort last year and for sharing your insights earlier in the webinar. And I'd also like to thank all the companies and change makers who graciously offered their time and contributed to the report that you all heard referenced. They're full of examples and insights and expertise. And honestly, we were really struggling to keep all that to a nice, concise set of pages. Finally, as we close out, in the chat and on the screen, we've shared a link and a QR code to a feedback survey. We would really appreciate if you all took just a few minutes to share your feedback on today's webinar. And finally, as you all are doing that and we're closing out, I just wanted to give a set of extra thank yous to the folks who are in the background really making things work today. So we have Karen Mack, Alicia Dunn, and Mary Gahn from FSG's communication teams. They've been phenomenal, both with the report and today's webinar, all the behind the scenes prep. And lastly, I'd just like to say, if you are rethinking your company or your organization's disaster response approach, how you can think about those various levers that Megan talked about, or working at different stages of the disaster management cycle, or you just like to discuss ideas heard today or how to partner with peers and others, please reach out. We're always looking to learn more and to share those learnings with others. So we would really love to take the time to connect with you. And with that, thank you again to everyone for joining today. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you to you all as our audience, and please enjoy the rest of your days.